Greetings, Fred in Alaska. Thanks for joining me. It's fuck that cold outside, -18. The sun's out, but it's beautiful, but no, too cold. Anyway, so what was I gonna say? Oh, I'm sorry, nothing pertinent. So what I want to share with you today comes from Alan. Alan from Montana loved to fly fish, and he had heard stories about trout, grayling, etc., dolly vardens, all that, you know, in Alaska that were as big as your leg and yada yada yada. So for a good 10 years he saved money to go on his dream float trip. He wanted to go somewhere remote. He didn't know where at the time, but he knew he wanted to be remote and do some fly fishing in Alaska. And he wanted to go where the goods are, you know, where the good sized fish are and whatnot. So unbeknownst to him, he didn't know where he was picking, but he picked Little King Salmon River, which is tributary to the Nuyakuk River. It's very, very remote. Not very many people go there to fish, but that's where he picked, and he hasn't been back to Alaska since, or in the outdoors. So I want to thank Alan for sharing to begin with, because it's been about a year trying to get things together about this encounter, because he had lost my contact info, had stuff going on in the background, and finally able to get back a hold of me. But anyway, I digress. Let's get into it. So he paid, initially he was going to pay a charter service, a fishing group, you know, a lodge potentially, and he saw what they were charging and was like, jeez, you know. So he took a couple of years to plan his own trip and save a substantial amount of money. Downfall is he would not be with a group. He would be dropped off by himself and picked up by himself once he reached the Nuyakuk River, and that was his overall plan. So his plan was to take a couple days to float the Little King Salmon River down to the Nuyakuk, hang out on the Nuyakuk until his ride would pick him up. So he got flown in by float plane, dropped off at a small lake that's part of the Little King Salmon River. It's just, you know, and so where he got dropped off, he had to sit there. The pilot stayed for a little bit, helped him and float his little floats, and he basically was on an inner tube with legs that go through. You can walk on the ground and whatnot, you know what I mean? Have you guys seen those? It's basically waders connected to a floaty, and that's what he chose to use. No judgment. I personally like to not be a victim of the current, you know, and him having the legs down, you know, in the water, that's a long time to be in cold water, trust me. Even with the neoprenes and all that stuff, it's still cold as shit. But anyway, Alan had it figured out, and all he had with him was a backpacking shotgun, a single shot. He said it was, he doesn't remember the brand, it was some off brand, but it was a single shot 12 gauge, and he had a 357 Magnum. And this 12 gauge sat right on his float, right in front of him, had one of those pouches for his flies, had a sage rod, 7-footer, and he had basically a backpack duffel bag with a bunch of stuff that he basically just kept on his back the whole time he was floating. Now, if he had wanted to, he could have floated down that thing in no time, you know, within the time of an afternoon, you know, with the current and stuff. But he was taking his time. And so he would get to a spot, it was kind of nice, he would pull himself out of the water, shed the little floaty, and fly fish. And he was loving it. He was catching rainbows, catching dolly vardens, grayling. He was loving it. He was only keeping, he wouldn't keep any of the rainbows, but he would keep some of the dolly vardens for pan fryers and whatnot. So the first 4 hours were great. He was loving it. Sometimes he would smack a horsefly, use that as bait, you know, catching grayling and whatnot. And he just having the time of his life. up until he saw something across the river. He was standing in some shallow water near the gravel and whatnot on this bank, and he's looking due south across the Little King Salmon River, and he notices what he thought was a tree stump. Thinking nothing of it, he just kind of looked at it a little bit. It was out of place because it was a big ass tree stump, but there's no big trees around. It's all just brush, willows and stuff, right? So he kind of looks at it a little bit, and then he hears a raven making raven noises, which, if you don't know what a raven sounds like, they sound like crows. It's a larger crow, same family, but much bigger. And anyways, making all these caw noises and all this and that. So he figures, oh, well, there's a raven over there. Maybe that's where it's nesting. And that's why I'm hearing this noise. Because he's not seeing any ravens. He's not seeing a sign of any raven. All he's hearing is the noise. So he's got this weird tree stump, raven noises. Oh, no big deal. He continues doing what he's doing. Now, he gets onto a fish, and so he wades out into the water up to his knees. And he said he is about 8 feet from the opposite bank as he's sitting there fighting this fish and reeling it and letting it play itself out, you know, and whatnot. And just as he was getting it up close to him to get a good look at it, it was a nice rainbow. He said it was probably about a 20-inch rainbow, and he was just like, oh, I got to keep this one, you know, is what he was thinking. And so as he's getting it close, he has this little net that he keeps on a sling, and this net's the size of like a little fucking racquetball, you know, racket. The size of a racquetball, tennis ball racket, right? And he's scooping down, and as he's sliding the net down into the water, a rock hits it. Good sized rock comes in off of his right hand side, hits right dead center of the net, and plops it right out of his hand. By happenstance, hit the line too, broke the line, so he loses his net from the rock. The rock in the net hit the fish on its way down, bust nets loose from the hook, and the fish is gone, and his net is now at the bottom of the river. He's confused as shit. He's trying to stumble because he's focused on the fish. All he's got on him, the 12 gauge is right over there about, you know, 20 feet away. He's got 357, and he's basically more focused on this net that he's about to lose, and he's upset that he lost the fish. He's so enthralled in what he's doing, he doesn't realize a rock just knocked your freaking net into the water that's causing what's going on. And as he's fumbling for it, it's all dawning on him because it all happened so fast, right? He's like, where's this rock come from? So he immediately spooked. He sits up, you know, stands up fully, you know, all the way, and is looking around, and he's not seeing anything. So he retreats back across, you know, screw the net. What the hell's going on here? He's continuing to get his line in on his rod, and he sets it down, and he's looking around, and he's trying to figure out what just happened. He's replaying it in his head, and Alan said that's when he looked up and saw that the stump was now directly across from him, looking at him. He said it was like a grizzled black, a little bit of brown spotches here and there. Had primarily a black looking face, black in color, thick eye bridge, and the hair was missing from around the eyes up to under the nose and around the cheekbones. He said it looked like severely worn black leather, real wrinkly. He said the eyes he couldn't really make out, but they looked black from his distance and, you know, his perspective, and its face, it was backlit by the sun up in the sky, so he was getting kind of a shaded look at it. He could see the glint in the eyes from the daylight, and so he stares at it a minute like, holy, what the hell am I looking at? He said that's when he made eye contact, is when this thing started ripping brush, moving back and forth, ripping brush out of the ground, started making all these weird noises. He said it sounded almost like hyenas, you know. He compared it to a video he saw on hyenas in the African plains, and they're all making this kind of barking, yapping kind of noise. He said it was eerily similar to that, but different. It was a lot lower in tone, but that was the closest thing he could, you know, compare it to. he said as it's doing this, he is already over sliding into his tube thing, because he's by himself. He grabs the shotgun, he's trying to put his rod away, he's trying to focus on getting his stuff together, and this thing is like maybe 30 feet away doing this, walking back and forth. He said it was about 8.5 foot tall, about roughly 4 foot wide. He said it wasn't overly tall, but it was robust. It was real thick. He said as he was getting into his wader stuff, because there was nowhere to run, all he could do was float away, and that's what he was working towards, which is, I mean, I gotta be honest, man. Can you imagine you're by yourself, which is, you never want to do that. But anyway, it was his choice. But you're by yourself, you got this stuff happening just feet away from you, and you're trying to get neoprene waders on, right? I'll pass. Any day I will pass. So he works himself into it. Meanwhile, he's got the single shotgun next to him. He's got his 357 out next to the shotgun, and he's looking directly across from him as he's working this stuff on. He gets it on. He's got his pack on, and he's doing something with his rod, because he put it back in its case. Now, the nerves of steel it took to do all this, and I asked him, I was like, well, how in the hell did you have the fortitude to sit there and do that? He was like, I didn't have a choice. Alan said, I had to gather up myself. Where was I going to run? He said, where was I going to run? My only out was by water. I wasn't going to out hike this thing. I wasn't going to outrun it. And fair enough, but that was his mindset at the time. Alan, very, very smart guy. Former law enforcement, worked for the Forestry Service as well. He had heard stories in the past down Oregon, Washington of, Sasquatch encounters and stuff, but they were always spotted and they walked off, versus what he's seeing in front of him, this thing throwing a fit, ripping vegetation out of the ground and making all these weird noises. He said it was upset at his presence, but it wasn't aggressively. It could have easily jumped right over and snatched him up, and fair enough. But this thing was staying on that bank and ripping stuff and just throwing a fit. So he gathered up his stuff, he's got it on, he put the 357 right in his vest for easy access, and he's got this single shot 12 gauge. He said he'd never use a single shotgun ever again. But anyway, he walks down the bank into where he can get into the water, and so he does so, and as he does so, this thing stops ripping stuff up and is standing still, watching him as he's starting to drift away. He said the further he got, as soon as he was almost out of view of this thing, it would catch up and just stay within view, almost like it's, yeah, I got you, you keep moving, kind of is what he was picking up from it, like it was escorting him out, right? So this goes on for a little bit, and he's focusing on this thing and what's going on, and not all the stuff, the vegetation around him. He's just not paying attention to it. He's got a focus, and it's over there, and it was just tearing shit up, right? He said as he floats down, he gets to a point where he's not all that far from the mouth of the Little King Salmon River, to where it meets up with the Nuyakuk River, which is on like a horseshoe bend, and there's a bluff off to the left hand side as you come out of the Little King Salmon River. So he could see the bluff a little ways in the distance, and he could see the denser vegetation that he's coming up into. So it was fairly low vegetation, but a lot of it, I mean low as in height, but it was coming up to a batch of trees off to his left, and thicker vegetation on the right, and it just gets denser and denser, and more stuff's hanging over the river, right? So he's really feeling claustrophobic as he's getting closer to this point. He said as he got where he stopped focusing so much on behind him, he felt like, okay, I'm out of the area, it's no longer showing itself, I'm good. He has the shotgun laid on a little floaty, and he's got the 357 in his hand, and he's literally coming down from the adrenaline dump. He's shaking, he's trying to like focus. He said he kept getting this tunnel vision, and like everything would look surreal. He was having a hard time keeping track of his thoughts. He said his thoughts were all over the place, and just basically panicking is what it boils down to. I mean, let's be honest. So as he's going along, he said off to his right hand side, he sees this thing again, and it's standing there, and he can't tell what it's holding, but it's holding something. And he said as he's getting closer, at this point he's got the hammer cocked on a 357, he's pointing in that direction, and this thing's just looking at him, and it had some form of stick in its hand. He said because of the vegetation, he couldn't tell if it was broken off, if it had been sharpened. He wasn't sure, but this thing raised it up like it was about to chuck it at him, and he let 2 shots go, bam, bam. He said it dropped the stick and took off away from him in the brush, out of sight, right? He said he's pretty sure he hit it, and he didn't want to shoot, but the way it was lifted up, that stick, it's go time. There's no negotiating that. He said he was panicked. He could barely touch the ground at this point in the river, so he gets over to where he's just tippy-toeing along, trying to twist himself and keep a line of sight in the direction, because he just shot, right? So he's kind of twisting around to the way he doesn't want to, and he's trying to correct with using one hand and swishing himself around in the water, right? Well, he's listening, and his ears are ringing a little bit from the gunshots, but his adrenaline's pumping so hard he's barely noticing it, but he's hearing movement, and it's from the direction this thing took off, but it's now going off to his left, because he's facing the opposite riverbank to the south side of the river. He's facing that and kind of drifting parallel in the river, facing that opposite bank where this thing was just standing, right? He said he heard it moving and just was like, oh man. He didn't know what to do. He didn't know what to do. So as he's floating, he pops open his 357, takes out the 2 empty cartridges, reloads it with 2 fresh ones, shuts it. He had some 180 grain wad cutters, if you're curious. And so there he sat, holding his 357. He said he wanted to use the shotgun, but it was just 1 shot, and he would have to fumble with setting it down and potentially losing it. Instead, he just held the 357 for more shots, right? And so he's panic stricken. He hears this movement. He's trying to figure out what's my next move. What is my next move? And he has none. He's got to float it out. There's no one else around. At one point, he did hear a float plane, but it was so far out of view that he wouldn't have got nothing. He couldn't have flagged it down or nothing. It was just a tiny speck, and he could hear the me. He wasn't getting nowhere with that, right? He gets about another bend down and around, and all of a sudden, there it is again in the brush. It was lower this time in the brush, had that stick again, and it was about to do the same thing. He lets off 3 shots this time. He said the first time he shot to hit it. The second time he shot was to run it off, because obviously his first 2 shots didn't do shit, and he just wanted to keep it off of him till he can get into somewhere more open, because at this point he's in dense vegetation on both sides. I mean, I've been up in that area. I know what it's like in those narrow creeks and rivers where vegetation is damn near right on top of you on each side. It's just very claustrophobic, especially with what the hell he was dealing with. So he shoots the 3 shots very near it. It takes off again. It did not drop the stick this time. It took it with it as it tore out of the brush. He's listening, and again he's got the ringing going on from the shots. And 357s, it had a 4-inch barrel. It was real snappy, right? When you shoot them. And so he's struggling with the ear ringing and trying to listen and track the direction this thing is moving, and he really can't. He said he was really getting like wanting to run out of his skin, and he couldn't, right? So he continues floating down, and as he's going, he hears something, and he's trying to figure it out, and it almost sounded like another float plane. And then he's trying to listen, and again, the ringing's going on, so he's having a real hard time with all the vegetation and the way the sound's moving around of pinpointing the direction. And finally, it becomes clear it's an outboard sound going towards the Nuyakuk, right? So he's like, oh, thank God. You know, he slips the 357 into his vest where he can easily grab it if he needs to. He slid the shotgun barrel down in between the waders and stuff so it wouldn't fall. So he's running with this tube around him in the water, pushing through, just trying to get closer to this outboard sound. Well, he finally gets up and around and is just clearing the trees and the thick vegetation. Hadn't seen anything since his second shots, you know, the 3 shots he took the second time. And when he gets around the corner, here comes a couple locals in a skiff, real narrow wooden skiff. They almost didn't see him. He jumps up, and then one of the guys turns around to the guy in the back and is like, you know, cut it down, cut it down. They slow down. They go past him a little ways. Guy pulls up the kicker so he doesn't ground out, and they start floating back to him. And the guys are like, hey, what are you doing out here? You know, he goes, you know, he tells them, hey, I was dropped off. I was floating this, and yada yada. They're like, you shouldn't be out here by yourself. He gave me the guys' names. I am aware of the family. Anyway, so they help him into the skiff, and they could tell he's obviously distressed, like distressed. He's pale. They kept asking him, are you okay? Are you okay? And he's trying to talk, but he's so overcome with the relief that people were there. He kept choking up trying to get it out. As luck would have it, this thing screamed off in the distance. Native boys immediately recognized. They you know, they said, calm down. They drop the kicker, boom, fire it up, and they go back down. They take him to the Nuyakuk, and then they take him up the Nuyakuk about a mile, and they get, because they were going for their whitefish net. They went to their net site. They were asking him, hey, what's going on? You're with us. You're safe. We got better rifles. We're good. Don't worry. What happened? He explains everything to the boys, and they kind of nodded, and they're like, don't ever come out here alone. We don't even feel comfortable with 2 of us, you know. And so, lesson learned on that. And I'm not going to make this an hour-long video by what they shared with him or whatever, because it's, you know, on the Nuyakuk River. I would say 95% of the encounters I've heard of involve people having to use firearms to keep these things back. My own experience included. So I want to thank Alan for sharing that. Also, Alan, I did reach out. I could not get a hold of the family that you were speaking of. There were 2 brothers that picked them up in the skiff. Once I do, back channel, I'll get a hold of you. I'll let you know or whatever. What else was there? Oh, I'm sorry. Before I forget, this happened approximately the 1 year before the COVID stuff. So things weren't all fucked up like they are now. Anyway, I want to thank Alan for taking the time to reach back out and get the information to me and chat with me and whatnot. I appreciate it. What else was there? Nothing offhand I could think of. I'm still about 6-7 videos behind, working on it. I'll get caught up as soon as I can. It is minus 18 degrees. The sun was up and then it set. No, I'm just kidding. It wasn't quite that bad. I got the mountains off in the distance, and the sun stays at one steady place on the horizon and gets behind the sun. Anyway, it's whatever. It's Alaska shit. Thank you guys for joining me. We'll catch you on the next one.